Hello, Intro Psych students. This is Dr. V. And as promised, here's the video lecture on the modules that we were hoping to cover today. Okay, so to keep up with the schedule, we're going to cover Module 26, which is Language and Thought. So that's this current one. Then we're going to go over the intelligence modules, Module 27 and Module 28, how we assess intelligence and genetic and environmental influences on intelligence. Okay, so let's get started. First off, just a couple basics. To try and put in perspective, why we talk about language in a psych class. Well, language is highly important. It's the reason why you're able to listen to this lecture right now, right? We learn through speaking language with some kind of language with each other, communicating in some kind of language. We can make connections and communicate with one another, right? So you're learning from me, but I can also communicate important information to you. We can plan, we can give commands, say, go over there, do this, do that, and that might help in a very kind of group oriented kind of setting where you have to cooperate. And we have more information about what someone else is thinking aside from the observable behavior. So, in other words, watching you without you talking, I have limited information about what's going on. But you being able to communicate with me and say what's on your mind gives me a better perspective of what is going on emotionally, physically, whatever it is. So language is highly useful, right? We kind of take that for granted, just like we take for granted our senses and things like that. And so language has some interesting applications in psychology. So, couple of basic things first off when we think about language. There's a ton of stuff that goes on with language. If you're interested in language and the intersection of psychology and language, you can study psycholinguistics. And so there are psycholinguistic psychologists who look at issues of comprehension. For instance, in jury decision making, if you've ever served as a juror, those instructions on what to do as a juror and also the law that they describe to you is really confusing. And so psycholinguists can work to help improve comprehension of jury instructions, to try and tone down the language so it's not so legal heavy and it's understandable to lay people who serve on juries, right? So language has a really interesting place in psychology. So first off, we have phonemes, okay? This is just the smallest unit of sound in any given language. And in the English language, it's typically vowels and consonants. So things like on this chart, the s sound, the t sound, the p sound, these are phonemes, smallest unit of sound. A ch, a sh, all of these are phonemes, okay? Compare that to morphemes. Morphemes are the smallest unit of sound that have some kind of meaning attached to it. Okay, so these are things like prefixes and suffixes, right? So this can be whole words and it can be parts of words. It's just the smallest unit of that word or part of a word that carries meaning. So take this actual word, for example, that's pneumono-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis. Whew, that's hard. And this is a lung condition. It's caused by small particles of volcanic silicon dust. Can be really, actually, it can really affect your breathing and things. But this was one whole word, but in it, it has several different morphemes. So pneumono means lung or respiration, ultra means beyond, micro, small, scop, look and see, ick is an adjective, and so on and so forth. Okay, so these are all morphemes. And actually, to give you one last example, think about like the word cats, C-A-T-S, right? Cats has two morphemes because cat is one and S is a morpheme because it means multiple or more than one. So whenever you tack on the S, like cats, that makes it plural, right? So that's another example of morphemes, right? And so those are kind of just generally some basics of language structure. There's a whole lot of other things attached to language, but this isn't a language class, so we're not going to talk about that. The last thing you should know is like grammar. Just about every language has some kind of rules of their language, right? So grammar will guide semantics and syntax. So semantics are the set of rules that define the meaning of sound. So it's why we say pneumono means lung or respiration, right? That's our rule. We think ultra should mean beyond. And that's semantics, is the meaning of words, right? The rules about the meaning of words. Whereas syntax is the rules of grammar. That's the rules of how we structure words together or string them together to make sentences. So just my ability to say it's the smallest unit of sound that carries meaning, that whole sentence, that's the syntax of the sentence, is the structure in which it occurs. For example, in Spanish, when you say like the White House in English, in Spanish that translates to Casa Blanco, right? And so casa is house, blanco is white. So your adjective comes after the subject or the noun of that sentence. But in English, it comes before. And so this is the syntax, this is grammar, right? This is the rules of our language, specifically the structure with which we put it together. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit of language development. In the early years, or I should say months, 0 to 4 months, this is known as the infantis period. This is when kids aren't generally speaking, okay? More of the time, infants instead are watching a lot, right? Because they've got those eyeballs, they can look around. And so they'll watch you talk, and they're going to start associating sounds with facial movements. And so that's helpful because then they can see how you produce certain sounds, certain words, and then attach that to how you move your mouth to do that. And so that's part of learning, right? So this is a receptive language phase because they're not speaking, but they're receiving information about language, okay? And so this is where they start to just discriminate between what you're saying are actual words with meaning versus you like kind of going, oh, or laughing, right? Just making some kind of sound. So it discriminates between just random sounds it hears and actual language, okay? So for instance, this kind of goes back to the McGurk effect a little bit, not so much, but it's kind of part of this idea of, you know, they know that the sound ba matches a certain mouth movement, right? So if you study babies, when they've acquired this ability to know what ba looks like coming out of your mouth, what'll happen is you'll see them hear the sound ba, and then they'll see 2 videos playing where somebody's mouthing ba facially or mouthing ga, let's say, or da facially. They'll stare longer at the one that matches the tone better, right? So the person saying ba and actually showing that with their lips will be stared at longer when the kid is hearing ba. So they're pairing it together, okay? At 4 months, now we're in a productive language stage, right? So right around 4 months. So don't freak out if your kid's maybe like a week late or something. But at 4 months, this is where kids really start to babble, okay? And particularly when they're babbling, it's in multilingual sounds or gestures, okay, for kids who aren't producing language and instead sign because they might be deaf, right? Deaf individuals sign, and that's how they communicate. So they can also gesture, okay? So kids babble, right? And they babble in all sorts of tones that are not needed for their primary language, okay? So let me play a video for you all, and let's see if it actually works. Oh, let's say I don't want to. I prefer
Kissing, clicking, sputtering.
Let me get the speakers going.
Kissing, clicking, sputtering. These are just some of the odd sounds that people around the world actually use to speak. Come hear these unusual phonemes, try them out yourself, and find out which one of them is something you say every day in English. Weird sounds in world languages. Not my normal fare, but I'm feeling something light before we get into more linguistic tales. Let's go. A row of languages all lined up in Africa have a sound written g-b, GB. So when you run across this name of a dance from the Côte d'Ivoire, you might be tempted to go French on it and call it gbe gbe. But notice that tie on the top, it's one single sound. To make it, bring your tongue up to the soft palate and make a g. But also close and release your lips during that g for a combo gb sound. Ba, big be. There's a voiceless form too, be. In the World Atlas of Language Structures, with its cross-language data on common and uncommon sounds, these are rare enough that they're only in 8% of the languages sampled. Can you putter your lips like if you're cold? Brrrr. That's a bilabial trill, phonetically speaking. Don't pat yourself on the back for it, though. A number of languages use pru and bru sounds. But in the far reaches of Brazil, deep in the Amazon, live the Pirahã, a people whose language has stirred up some linguistic controversy. One of its unusual features is a bilabial trilled affricate. To make it, they hold their tongue in position for a T sound against the teeth, then release it with that sputtering lip trill. Thru, thru. I see why this sound is rare. Pwa. This next type of sound might be more familiar to some of you out there, pharyngeals. The pharynx is straight in the back of your mouth, where the nasal cavity connects to the throat, connects to the voice box. If you bring the base, the root of the tongue, way back, the restricted airflow makes the sound. Am I breathing in your ear? This isn't creepy at all. Voice that sound, and it's ah. Do you know which major world language has sounds close to both of these and expects you to tell them apart from nearby glottal h and velar ch? It's Arabic and other Afroasiatic languages. In all, pharyngeals can be found in only 4% of the languages in that world sample. A Spanish island in the Canaries off the coast of Africa, La Gomera, makes some intriguing noises. Unlike the previous examples, their oddity isn't a sound, it's actually a whole way of speaking using whistles. It's called el silbo, the whistle, by locals who use high or low frequency, combined with either flows or breaks to communicate both vowels and consonants. The West African ba, that lippy trill in Brazil, pharyngeals in Semitic, so far our rares are clustered in hot zones. But this next rarity is found all around the planet. Prepare your tongue for dental fricatives. You won't really need much practice though, because English has them. Putting the tongue up against the teeth and pushing a stream of airflow around it this way is only done in somewhat over 7% of that world language sample. Alright, English. You know how French is infamous for its nasal sounds? Oh. French got them when a nosy sound spread one vowel over. That happens, but nasal spreading doesn't have to stop there. Spread away through vowels, through consonants, until whole stretches of sounds become downright infected with the nasal. Like in the Apena language of Colombia, where siaso comes out as siason. Lots of odd consonants so far, but I found some fun vowels along a river in Oaxaca, Mexico, in a town where they speak a Mazatec language. For every one normal vowel you give them, they have 3 for you. Normal A, which linguists call modal voice, but also breathy voice ah, and creaky voice ah. They even do this with nasals. Ah. Add to this that they also have tones, all these consonants you've never tried to tell apart, and even their own whistle speech, and you've got yourself a mouthful. One last one before we go. Time for the oddest speech sounds out there. Making their home in the southwest of Africa are the Khoisan languages. This isn't a single family, even though mass comparison struck again. It's a cluster of families renowned for possessing entire sets of sounds, called cliques. This is a kiss, a bilabial click. Kind of even looks like a kiss. To make it, speakers close their tongue against the back of the mouth, and also close both lips, but don't purse them. 2 closures. Then, using the tongue, they suck a pocket of air into that enclosed area. Finally, they let go of the lips, and out pops a trapping air between 2 closures, and then releasing the front closure can be applied to your teeth, the side of your mouth, the roof of your mouth. So much clicking! Click languages accounted for just 1.8% of that world language sample. Well, see, our world's languages are full of all kinds of meaningful, strange sounds. Maybe we'll take a linguistic trip to one of these hotspots and investigate further. Until then, stick around and subscribe for language.
Okay, so we're back. And so that was a nice little kind of introduction to all sorts of different sounds that people can make across the world. And kids have this ability, again, this is what I mean by this multilingual sound. They have the ability to make these different kinds of sounds early on. So we have the capacity for that. And that's why all these other individuals in other countries who maybe speak another language have the ability to make some of these sounds that we're not typically familiar with making in the English language. Okay, so keep that in mind as we move forward here. At 10 months, the child's babbling starts to become more specific to their native language. Okay, so if you're exposing a kid to one language, to English, they're going to start to lose the ability to speak in those multilingual sounds, some of them that you just heard, right? And so it's part of the synaptic pruning, right? If you don't use it, you lose it. So if you don't need that kind of ability to make certain sounds, then you're not going to practice it, you're not going to use it. So a couple of examples of those are people who speak Japanese, for instance, but not English, might have trouble distinguishing between la 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 and ra ra ra. Okay, and we'll see a short video about this. But people who speak English, for instance, but not Japanese, have trouble pronouncing the f, and I'm probably pronouncing it improperly, like the native Japanese speakers. It's not fu, it's not fu, it's fu. And so we'll watch a video real quick to demonstrate this.
Hey guys, this is Yu Hamza from JapaneseRabbit.com. Today we'll be going through the fu sound in Japanese. So this is called the voiceless bilabial frictative. Now when they say bilabial, it means that you're using your lips. So you use your upper lip and you use the bottom lip. So it's a bit different from f for Friday, because Friday, the f, you use your lower lip and you actually use your front teeth. You actually you have contact with your lower lips and the front end, the end of your front teeth. So this is the difference. And basically, try and make a flute out of your lips. And make sure that the gap is quite small, so that it's like you're having a lot of air going through a very small like tunnel. And the reason they call it frictative is because there's friction. You have friction between the air and then your upper lip and your lower lip, and they also vibrate, so that creates the friction. Okay, so let's just try and create the sound. So first, let's just try and close down our lips. And then let's blow air. Then when you add, well, in this case it's this is the sound that you're looking for. So for example, you have the word fusen. It's kind of like you're really blowing a balloon, because when you do that, you know, you have to hold the balloon with your mouth, and then you need to really like I don't know, you need to use your lips so that you can like you can pass air through, and that's what you're pretty much doing. So fusen, ha hi fu, and it's not hu, it's fu, and it's also not fu, it's fu. So try doing this, well, exercise, I guess, until you get used to it. It's basically only your lips that's being used to create this sound. So just focus on your lip movement, and that's it. And then you'll be able to create the fu sound. Alright, thank you.
Okay, we're back. And so that's a nice kind of demonstration of, again, this difference between 4 and 10 months of age. At 4 months, we have this capacity, but at 10 months, we start to lose this ability. We're just going to babble more specific to our native language, which is good because we're learning this language. But this kind of makes a good point when you want to learn a language, a second language, it's good if you have kids to start them early and to really introduce them to these sounds early on, because then it's going to be easier for them to speak like a native speaker when they've been exposed to these 2, 3, 4 different languages, whatever you decide to expose them to, if you expose them to anything. So at 12 months, right, we went to 4, then 8, now at 12, this is where kids typically hit the one-word stage. Again, if you've got kids and right around 12 months, it's not happening. Don't panic. These are just rough timelines. But, follow your doctor's instructions, obviously, about their progression, their development. So at 12 months, about a year, you start to get the one word stage. Kids understand and they say nouns. Okay, so because this makes this makes most sense. If they want something, if they need something, they can now tell you like mom or up or milk. Now they can say that because they've started to learn and identify and connect certain things with words, objects with words, what have you, right? At 18 to 24 months, they're going to start picking up two-word kinds of speech. We call it telegraphic or tweet speech. And so now they're throwing in verbs in the mix, right? So see bird, right? So see is the verb, bird being the noun. Read book, and they might make some grammatical errors, right? And not have that pronunciation quite down yet. Or go park. And so now they're better able to communicate with you what their needs are. At 24 months and beyond, then they start to speak in more full and complete sentences and understand these more complex sentences. And of course, then that gradually gets better over time. Okay, so that's what's going on with language development. So we've kind of talked about this before with Jeannie. If you all remember Jeannie the Feral Child in California, we'll revisit that. But we do know that there is a critical period in learning language. Okay, so roughly, and again, this is just a rough estimate, around the age of 7, this seems to be the cutoff period for learning and or mastering a language. So if you don't speak to a child or stimulate them in a way that they're going to learn a language where they can see your lips move or see you sign, for instance, for children who are deaf, then they're going to lose the ability to actually develop a language and speak it in a fluid way. Okay, speak it in a complete way. Okay, and so we saw that with Jeannie, but there's a couple of different bits of evidence for this. So if a deaf infant's parents don't use sign language to speak to their child, right, to communicate with them, I should say, the deaf infant will, if by the age of 7 this doesn't happen, will not be able to master sign language. Okay, so they're just like hearing individuals who are using verbal language. Deaf children who can't sign or aren't stimulated to sign, they're not being shown the language, they will lose this ability at this critical period, okay, if it's not being taught to them. And so they might be able to kind of speak in broken sign language if they're taught a little bit later in life, but it's hard to pick up this kind of fluid speaking if they're not shown this early on. Okay. And then, like I said, we talked about Jeannie the Feral Child, who in the 70s was found to have been severely abused and neglected by her parents. And so she was shut off from the world for a good 13 years. Okay, so she was well beyond the age of 7, where nobody would talk to her. And she never really acquired the English language in a fluid way, in a masterful way. She could speak kind of like tweet speech and put some sentences together and was learning from what the researchers could tell, but she didn't ever get to that point where she could speak it fluidly. And that's where we have some evidence to suggest there's probably a critical period around the age of 7. Again, this isn't like a hard and fast rule. Everybody is different, but generally speaking, around this age, this is the critical period. Okay. And like I kind of mentioned before, deaf children will babble with their hands if their parents are using sign language with them. So they're learning in a different way, right? They're non-hearing, so they'll watch, and again, they'll be able to pair these different kinds of motions with maybe certain actions with the parents, and they can, help communicate that by pointing to different objects to help them make connections between these objects or these things or these actions and their gestures. Okay. And one final thing I'll mention here. So one final point I'll make here about this critical period is this graph right here. So just to orient you, pretend this x-axis here is a person's age, okay? And particularly, this is the age that they immigrated to another country that had a different language. Okay, so let's say this is individuals who are coming from Mexico that are immigrating to the United States. They speak Spanish, right? And let's say you give them a grammar test. And this is the percentage that they get right on that grammar test. The earlier they immigrate to the country that has that second language, and maybe they have to learn, they're trying to learn English, the earlier they immigrate, the higher percentage they will have on that grammar test, the more language they will acquire or better acquire in English. But as the years go on, if they're not exposed to that second language, English, the age of immigration when they come to the United States, the later is, the less likely they are to acquire, their numbers go down in terms of their percentages on a grammar test. So then they're not as able to acquire quite a bit as much in terms of grammar or fluency in English as if they would have come earlier. So bottom line, long story short, the earlier you start with a language, the better able you'll be able to speak it like a native speaker would. Okay, so we've got a couple other fun videos to show you in this section. So we've talked about language acquisition, some critical period stuff. Now let's talk about some deficits that can occur with language. So aphasias are any kind of impairment of language, and we're going to learn about two main ones in particular. So typically, aphasia occurs when you receive damage to the left hemisphere. It could be physical damage, maybe viral, what have you. But when you have some kind of damage to your brain in the left hemisphere, this can affect your language. And it can affect it in two different ways, at least two different ways. There are other aphasias. But Broca's area is this area right here, is part of the left frontal lobe, right? So here's our frontal lobe, right? And here's Broca's area. So it's kind of right above our temporal lobe, okay? On your left side, left frontal. And, excuse me, this is important. This area is important for language production, okay? Your ability to actually get the words out, right? So Broca's aphasia is when you struggle to find words, but you can still comprehend other people's speech. So contrast it to comprehension, okay? You just can't get the words out. So let's watch a video where you'll see someone who has Broca's aphasia.
Can you tell us your name?
Mike Caputo.
And Mike, when was your stroke?
I was 7 years ago,
Okay.
and
what did you used to do?
worked Autodesk, seven sales, and worldwide, and very good. Yeah,
Okay. And who are you looking at over there when you turn your
that's
head?
my wife.
Okay. And why is she helping you to talk?
She's a speech.
So you have trouble with your speech.
Yeah.
And what's that called?
Aphasia.
All right. And so why don't you work now?
I do.
And what do you do now?
Voices of Hope aphasia.
And what is Voices of Hope?
Peterburg, and Dr. Hinckley, and myself, founder for me, and members the members, probably 60 people.
So 60 people are part of Voices of Hope,
Yes.
which is an aphasia support group
Yes.
that you founded.
Yes.
And Dr. Jackie Hinckley is part of that.
Yes.
Okay, great.
It's not a support group.
No,
It's
it's
a program.
programs. It's 3 days. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and and they laugh and talked. Music here, just beautiful. It's, you know,
Great.
yeah.
Can you tell me, what does it feel like to have aphasia?
It's hard. It's well, it's speech. It's like words that don't understand. Brain is good, you know, but it's speech like I don't know. It's like words. Yuck.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we're back. So, as you all saw in that video, Broca's aphasia is really about the inability to produce language, spoken, written, manual, okay, like signing. Okay, so you might have trouble writing full sentences or finding the words to speak, just like he was. He was looking for cues, or his wife was helping him try and find the word, right? So this is all what Broca's is about, okay? And so sometimes people with Broca's aphasia can sing songs and sing them fluidly, right? And so this is at odds with what we know about Broca's aphasia. When you have damage to this area, like the individual in the video who unfortunately had a stroke and it affected Broca's, some people can produce these songs, okay? And the reason behind this, they think, is what happens is this might be due to the fact that the song seems like a string of sound as opposed to words with meaning, right? And so Broca's area is all about being able to produce language, and so that's going to have meaning attached to it, and you can get the word out. But because singing sounds just like a string of sounds, that might be organized in a different area of your brain, and so you're able to get those words out. Okay, so interesting kinds of effects. Then you have Wernicke's area, okay, named for a German medical doctor. And this area is on our left, just like left hemisphere, right? Left temporal lobe. So, haha, we're, circling back to our very first modules on brain, neuro, psych kind of stuff, right? So you've got Wernicke's area in your temporal lobe, this little nugget right here. And it's a little bit pushed back. And Wernicke's is important for understanding language, so language comprehension and reception. Okay, so Wernicke's aphasia, right, an impairment of Wernicke's area in particular, is you're going to have problems understanding written and spoken language. Okay, so you can produce speech, unlike Broca's aphasia. You're going to be able to produce it, it's going to come out, but the speech makes no sense, right? So Wernicke's has to do with understanding. It makes no sense. You might not recognize that it makes no sense, but it makes no sense to the person speaking it. Okay, so understand that Wernicke's is about understanding language, so you're going to have problems with it making sense, whereas Broca's aphasia is going to have to do with language production, getting the speech out. So let's watch a little quick video on Wernicke's aphasia.
Hi, Byron. How are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talked with the people for them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him. With luck for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
Juneau.
sort it right here, and they'll save their hands right there for
And-
them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment, they don't show a darn thing.
With the iPad that we were doing. We, like, here?
I might change for me and change hands for me with Happy. I would talk with Donna sometimes. We're out with them. Other people are working with them. I'm very happy with them.
Good.
This girl was very good and happy when I play golf and hit other trees. We play out with the hands. We save a lot of hands on hold for us, other hands. I don't know what you get, but I talk with a lot of hand for him. Sometime. Am I talk of any more to saying?
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I hope the world lasts for you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Okay, so you can clearly see the differences between Broca's and Wernicke's. The gentleman with Broca's aphasia had that really difficult time trying to get the words out, whereas this gentleman could get the words out. They just didn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, some of the syntax usually is intact. In other words, it sounds like a sentence, it just doesn't make sense. So the nouns, verbs, pronouns, all that stuff is in the right order, but it's not making any sense. So here are a couple of ways to remember for the test these different kinds of aphasias. So here's a rhyme that I found very helpful. If Broca's is broken, no words will be spoken, right? So language production is a problem. Wernicke's aphasia is, if Wernicke's ain't playing, you won't know what I am saying, right? So then it's about comprehension. The words come out, but it makes no sense, okay? So last couple of things on language development. There's this gentleman by the name of Benjamin Whorf who put forth this idea of linguistic determinism. And basically, this is the idea that languages determine the way we think. So, for instance, the Hopi have no past tense, okay? And so, according to linguistic determinism, this means that language is going to determine the way we think. So if we don't have a concept for past tense, then they can't think about the past, according to Benjamin Whorf, right? And so we kind of ask ourselves, is this a true thing? Well, not so much, right? We know that people can think about the past, even if they don't have the language of the past, if they don't have a past tense. So linguistic determinism isn't really a thing. Language doesn't necessarily determine what we think, but it can influence what we think. So let's actually listen to a clip. This is a clip from a podcast called Hidden Brain. It's by NPR. Shankar Vedantam is a gentleman who runs this, and he has some really cool stories about psychological phenomenon. So I highly recommend this podcast, Hidden Brain, to learn more about this stuff. But let's listen to a really quick clip. They're going to interview an individual who's from Cape York, Queensland, Australia. And let's listen.
My guest today is, why don't I let her introduce herself?
The way to say my name properly in Russian is Kaleria Romanovna Boroditskaya. So I don't make people say that.
Well, that's kind of you. In the English-speaking world, she goes by Lera Boroditsky. Lera is a cognitive science professor at the University of California, San Diego. Long before she began researching languages as a professor, foreign languages loomed large in her life. When she was 12, her family came to the United States from the Soviet Union.
My family is Jewish, and we left as refugees. I decided it was very important for me to learn English because I'd always been a very verbal kid, and I was always the person who recited poems in front of the school and led assemblies and things like that. And to arrive in a new place where you can't tell a joke and can't express an idea, it's just really painful because you feel like your whole self is hiding inside and no one can see it. And so I set myself the goal that I would learn English in a year and I wouldn't speak Russian to anyone for that whole first year. And I did that.
Lara now tries to understand languages spoken all over the world. She once visited an Aboriginal community in Northern Australia and found the language they spoke forced her mind to work in new ways. Just saying hello was difficult.
I had this wonderful opportunity to work with my colleague Alice Gaby in this community called Pumparau on Cape York. And what's cool about languages like the languages spoken in Pumparau is that they don't use words like left and right, and instead everything is placed in cardinal directions like north, south, east, and west. So the way you say hi in Kuuk-Thaayorre, one of the languages spoken here, is to say, which way are you heading? And the answer should be north, northeast in the far distance. How about you? So quite literally, to get past hello, you have to know which way you're heading. And in fact, speakers of languages like this have been shown to orient extremely well, much better than we used to think humans could. We always knew that certain species of animals had abilities to orient that we thought were better than human, and we always had some biological excuse for why we couldn't do it. We'd say, oh, well, we don't have magnets in our beaks or in our scales or whatever. But it turns out humans can stay oriented really, really well, provided that their language and culture requires them to keep track of this information.
I understand that if you're on a picnic with someone from this community and you notice an ant climbing up someone's left leg, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to tell that person, look, there's an ant on your left leg.
Well, there may not be a word for left to refer to a left leg. In a lot of languages, there isn't. So you might say, there's an ant on your northwest leg. The fun example I give my students is imagine playing the hokey pokey in a language like this. There's no left leg or right leg. As soon as you move the leg, it becomes a different leg. So you may start with moving your southwest leg in, but then you have to move your northeast leg out.
Southwest leg in and you shake it all about. You do the hokey pokey and you turn yourself around. That's what it's all about.
All right, so that was just a bit of the clip from his entire podcast on that topic. If you're interested, you can hunt it down. But again, sorry, I misspoke. She did some research in Cape York in Queensland, Australia, with the Pumparau and these Aboriginals. And again, this kind of just gives us this contrast to linguistic determinism. It's not that people can't think about things that they have no sentence structure for. It's really just the way we have, our languages can influence how we think, and maybe even some skills, like these individuals who are highly oriented to north, south, east, and west. Like I can barely, turn around and then figure out where I am on campus, right? So beyond that, there's also other evidence to suggest that even though we don't have a word for something, that doesn't mean we don't have some sort of concept about it, right? So what are some things that you don't have a specific name for that you can still articulate in the language, or, maybe we don't, but we can put words together to describe it. For instance, the German word Schadenfreude means a feeling of enjoyment from other people's misfortunes. So apparently this is important enough in their language to have one word dedicated to it when you kind of feel that sense of enjoyment when something bad happens to somebody else, right? So, or some maybe misfortune. Tarle is a Scottish word that talks about the panicky hesitation just before you introduce someone whose name you can't remember, right? So you might have a friend, you're like, oh, this is someone, you let them kind of introduce themselves because you can't remember. Apparently the Scottish have a word for that, okay? Sorry about that. So language may not determine what we think, right? Just because the Hopi don't have a past tense doesn't mean they can't think about the past. Instead, it's going to influence our thinking, okay? Sorry about that. So, last couple of things on language. Emotions also kind of play a role in our language, or have this kind of interaction. Right. So, for instance, the Japanese have more words for interpersonal emotions. And so this can be highly cultural in that Japanese provides more, they provide more of these words for like sympathy and empathy, because they might need to express this more so in their culture. So they're a collectivist culture. They tend to care about the group and what the group thinks and keep maintaining group harmony. And because of that, they might have to have more of these words to display any kind of interpersonal communications, right? Have some kind of sympathy, empathy for others because they care about others more so in a cultural sense, okay? And also, personality can change depending on the type of language being used in the moment. So for instance, some studies have been done where they've looked at Chinese-born university students. So for instance, Chinese individuals who immigrate to Canada and attend university at one of the universities in Canada. If they are asked to provide an English description of their personality, it tends to fit a more traditional kind of Canadian person's profile, like personality profile. Whereas if they're asked to provide a description of themselves in Chinese, it better fits a Chinese profile of like a typical Chinese individual. And again, you can think of this in terms of cultural differences. Cultures in East Asia tend to be more collectivist. They tend to care about the group and group harmony versus more Western cultures who tend to be more individualistic. And so you can even see these kinds of differences. A Czech proverb once said, learn a new language and get a new soul. So again, language can influence the way we think and even the way maybe we explain who we are, right? Describe our own personalities. And finally, there's also some other interesting influences of language on thought in terms of things like color perception. So for instance, different languages can vary in the way they separate blue from green, right? Or maybe they don't have separate words for these colors. So that's going to kind of influence the way they think about this array of colors, for instance, right? So you might have people who say, this is clearly the line where these are green colors and these are blue colors, or some people show some kind of overlap, right? So depending on how we label blue and green, we might call the three squares on the left green and blue and all that kind of stuff. And so it might be harder for us to distinguish certain colors from being anything but blue if our language says, we call them blue, right? Versus things that are clearly green to us. And another thing is, like, for instance, you heard the Pra people of Brazil in that video way back when they're talking about click languages and all that fun stuff. They usually count to 1, 2, or many, right? So they don't have this concept for 3 or more, or they're not going to need to do math like calculus or algebra. And because of that, then that doesn't really require them to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and have a whole array of numbers in their languages. Okay, so that might make it hard for them to keep track of exactly 3 or exactly 4 and things like that. So they probably won't do trigonometry. But if it's not required of them, then it's not a problem. And so before we move on to intelligence, one final note about language. I always find this research really fascinating, and partially it's because I'm semi-bilingual. But bilingual individuals and multilingual individuals, I should say, people who speak more than one language, tend to have some interesting benefits and trade-offs in terms of various cognitive abilities. Okay, so for people who are bilingual or multilingual, they tend to have to inhibit one language while they speak the other. So there's not some on-off switch where you can turn off English and start speaking Spanish, or turn off English and start speaking French, whatever the case may be. Instead, they have to work to inhibit that response. Just like, let's say you're on a diet and you're trying to inhibit your desire to eat some chocolate cake that's in the fridge at work, right? Somebody brought it in for somebody's birthday. And so you're trying to say, oh, I'm staying away from that because I'm trying to be good and healthy and watch my sugar intake. Right? That's inhibition. That's you trying to self-regulate and not let your desire to eat that chocolate cake overcome your desire to, be fit and healthy, or lower your amount of sugar that you take in. So The same thing's going on with bilingual individuals where they're inhibiting one language while trying to speak the other. And so this leads to more practice of executive function. And that's that prefrontal cortex that helps us perform these executive function tasks like inhibition, self-regulation, and task switching. Right. So again, there's no such thing as multitasking. It's all about task switching. And so bilingual individuals are also practicing this. They're switching their attention from one language to the other, right? Or they maybe are switching conversation to conversation. Some people speaking Spanish, maybe they have relatives who are they only speak Spanish or one language, and then they're speaking to friends who only speak another one, right? So they have to practice this quite a bit. So then you start to see benefits. People who have this bilingual or multilingual ability also tend to have better attention skills, better empathy and perspective taking. And we think this is due to being able to switch back and forth between these languages and understand people a little bit better from different perspectives, and inhibition, right? Self-regulation. So this can translate to other tasks and other areas of their life. The trade-off is when you learn another language, most of the time, you're not going to have quite as an extensive vocabulary in each of your languages that you learn. So you'll have a lower bank of vocabulary for English and for Spanish words because there's only so much you can, cram into your brain and learn. And so your vocabulary might be a little less, a little more limited, not so much that you couldn't be fluent in both languages, but that's the trade-off, is the vocabulary usually is a little bit smaller. But there are all sorts of good benefits to learning a second language. Okay. So we'll skip our quiz questions. I thought I hid these. Okay, so now we're going to cover intelligence. First, module 27, methods for, how we developed our ways to assess intelligence. And then we're going to get into some things that affect intelligence, what predicts intelligence, basically. Okay, so we're going to now continue on with intelligence. Okay, and so we're going to cover module 27, where we're assessing or looking at how we kind of develop methods to assess intelligence, what we consider intelligence, and really get into the nitty-gritty there. Okay, so let's keep on moving. So intelligence, let's define it as our ability to learn from experience, to problem solve, and use all this information to adapt to new situations, right? So this is what we're going to call intelligence. People may appear to have special talents in science, math, arts, athletics, etc. And due to this, there are two main schools of thought about intelligence in the world of research on this. Okay, so some people think intelligence is one single overall ability, and other people say that intelligence is several specific abilities, but this is the key, okay, that they're independent of one another. So if you're high in science, that's not going to predict whether or not you're high in math skills, okay? Whereas your people who believe intelligence is a single overall ability camp, they believe that, yeah, you can have, we can measure your ability in science, math, art, and all that, but they're all going to be correlated with one another. They're all going to be, as one goes up, the other one also goes up. So you can predict one with the other. Okay, so let's explore these schools of thought. The one camp that explores this idea of one type of intelligence is was really put forth by Charles Spearman, and he called this overall type of intelligence general intelligence. We also call it G. Okay, G as in lowercase g. So again, he put forth the idea that there's similar performance across diverse intelligence tests. In other words, we can assess you across different types of intelligences. So he's not saying that there aren't different types, but instead he's saying that these types of intelligences, these different types of tests, are all related to one another in an individual person. So again, if you score high in math, you score high in science. Okay, so you're able to maybe reason quantitatively, or if you have, if you have high quantitative skills, you might also have good problem-solving skills, good working memory. Okay, so Spearman was the individual who helped us develop factor analysis. Okay, and so factor analysis is a statistical procedure that's used to identify these clusters of related items. Okay, we call them factors, and that's why it's called factor analysis. So for instance, you can have several items on a scale, right? So a scale item for something called social dominance orientation might be some groups of people are simply inferior to others. Inferior groups should stay in their place. Okay, so we've got 2 items there from SDO, social dominance orientation. Now, again, you can have multiple items, right? Maybe I give you a 16 item scale that measures social dominance orientation. And all of these scale items are asking the same question just in different ways, or they're kind of trying to target different areas of this one construct called social dominance orientation. So again, this idea extends to intelligence in that we can measure all these different intelligences, your working memory, your ability to process visual spatial information, quantitative reasoning, flexible thinking, problem solving, all these various things that we think inform us on about your intelligence level, and they're all going to be related to one another. Okay. Other people who have theories of multiple intelligences disagree with G. Instead, they say intelligence are independent of one another. So yes, we can measure verbal comprehension, quantitative reasoning, whatever, but one's not going to predict the other in the same person. Okay. So for instance, Lewis Thurnston, and a couple of other people, I should say, well, we'll talk about Lewis Thurnston, I guess, first. He proposed that there are 7 clusters of abilities, and he said there's verbal comprehension, inductive reasoning, word fluency, spatial ability, memory, perceptual speed, and numerical ability. Okay. Howard Gardner talks about 8 multiple intelligences, where there are people who are naturalists, linguists, logical, mathematical people, and interpersonal, intrapersonal, and so on and so forth. Okay. And so these individuals propose that we have multiple intelligences and they're not going to be correlated. Again, we can measure all these things separately, but they're saying they're independent, whereas G is saying we can measure all these things, but they're all still going to be correlated with one another. Okay, so performance, though, does tend to, when you look at the research on this, when you measure people in all of these different areas, whether it be the 7 clusters of abilities or the 8 multiple intelligences, people, their performance in one domain, like verbal comprehension, tends to be similar to the other domains. So if they're good with verbal comprehension, they have better memory, they have better spatial ability, and so on and so forth. Same thing with these 8 multiple intelligences. So G seems to be winning out. And again, a lot of people struggle with this because they think, oh, well, you know, they're all these different kinds of intelligences. And yes, G is not saying that there can't be different things that you are defining as an intelligence. But when you measure all of these different intelligences in one person, it's going to be correlated across those domains. Okay. So within intelligence, we have a disorder, or a syndrome, I should say, that kind of demonstrates some interesting things. Okay, so Savant syndrome is a syndrome where the condition, it's a condition where someone has some kind of exceptional skill in a very specific kind of area. Okay, but they're also then going to be impaired in other areas. So let's watch a real quick video clip to demonstrate or show you an individual who has Savant syndrome.
I'm looking forward to meeting Kim Peek because he's meant to be amazing. He was the guy that the Rain Man character was based on. This is really exciting for me because it's my first time meeting someone else with whom I have to bond.
Daniel makes his way to Salt Lake City to help him and his father are waiting for him. They head off to a quiet corner, where Daniel can find out more about Kim's stupendous memory.
with total photographic memory. He remembers everything he's ever read. He can tell you every city in the United States, this highways in this area closed in this zip code, in this television stations, in this counties, and when it was made a state. The history of any country, all the rulers, and when they served presidents of this country, when they were born, their wives, their families, all of NASA's accomplishments, when they went up, when they came down, what they're doing. He can talk about the Bible, he can quote scriptures, he can tell you anything about it you want to ask him about. It seems like everything he reads, he maintains. In 9 months, the neuropsychiatrist said he's severely mentally retarded. He will never be able to learn. You should put him in an institution and forget about him.
But Kim was reading encyclopedias by age 4 and had finished the high school curriculum by 14.
Goodbye, old pain. I'm a leaving Cheyenne. You know that?
How fast can he read?
He reads a page that you and I would read in 3 minutes, approximately. It takes about 8 to 10 seconds. He reads the left page, the left eye, right page, the right eye, and remembers about 98% of it.
Go back to here.
Kim, my birthday is January 31st, 1979.
It was a Wednesday, and this year it's a Saturday, turn 2044 on a Sunday.
What year did Queen Victoria become queen?
1837 to 1901.
Kim, if Winston Churchill was alive today, how old would he be?
130.
And what day of the week would his birthday fall on this year?
It would be on a Tuesday, the last day of November.
In 1987, Kim met actor Dustin Hoffman and became the inspiration for the hit movie Rain Man.
We went to Hollywood next morning, and Kim spent the day with Dustin and all of his film friends. It was amazing, all the things they asked him and all the things he knew. It was just like I had known him before. There were so many new things that came out of him.
Although I'm much older, you're still a fine man.
Thank you. So are you.
Yes.
He says you don't have to be handicapped to be different, because everybody's different.
There are all sorts of associations bubbling over in his mind.
No wonder you look like Mary Ruth has.
It was almost as if he had too much information and he couldn't get it out quickly enough. His parting words to me were, we looked into each other's eyes and he said, one day you'll be as great as I am. And that was a wonderful compliment and what an inspiration to have.
Okay, so, well, before I give you all that question, just to give you a little bit more information, the gentleman he was talking to in the video was Kim Peek. He unfortunately passed away in 2009, but he had an incredible memory for dates, as you could see. Anything he read, anything he really looked into, he memorized, and had this incredible ability to, tell you the day and time of certain events, or to figure out what day of the week it was when it was your birthday, right? And so he inspired the movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise, in case you all want to watch an oldie but a goodie. Not that old. But they previously thought he maybe had autism, but it was actually believed that he had FG syndrome, which is a genetic disorder that's marked by some physical anomalies and some developmental delays and intellectual disabilities and other kinds of stuff. But he had this savant syndrome where he really had exceptional skill in a specific area. The guy he was interviewed by, Daniel Tammet, was another savant. He has an incredible memory for numbers, can do really large mathematical calculations in his head. He's fluent in 7 languages, and he's developing his own language. If not, he's already kind of finished it. And he also has synesthesia. Remember, we covered that. He feels that numbers have their own unique shape, color, texture, and feel in his mind. Okay, so the question then that I'm posing is, and I want you to maybe take a minute to pause the video here, but how do you think how does savant syndrome support multiple intelligence theories? And go ahead and pause if you need some time to think. So to come back with an answer, and there's still time to pause, but to give you sorry about that. To give you an answer to this is that because these individuals have highly exceptional skills in one area, that gives some support to think that these intelligences can be kind of separated. But this is a really extreme case. Most of the time, when you have an individual who has savant syndrome, right, they're going to have this extraordinary ability in one area, in one kind of intelligence. But you still kind of see some crossover. They have disabilities in kind of other ways and some shortcomings and trade-offs, but still, they might have an awesome memory for numbers, memories, and things like that. But the general population still follows the path of G. And so you can have a pretty high ability in math, let's say, and that's going to also be correlated with a high verbal ability, even if you think you kind of have some differences. So you might think that you're better at math than you are at writing, but your skill level in both of those is still going to be quite high versus somebody who might be low in math and they think they do a little bit better in verbal. They might be on the lower end of both abilities, right? So even though you can see some differences, they're still correlated. You might be really high performing, low performing towards the middle. Okay, so there are a couple other things to think about when we think about intelligence. Other researchers have extended the definition of intelligence. And so there are tons of researchers you can look at that define it differently, but G tends to win out. But beyond looking at these kinds of intelligences about verbal, quantitative abilities, etc., there are also things like social and emotional intelligence. So Edward Thorndike put forth the idea of social intelligence. Okay, so you might want to think about this for a second. Like, do you know someone who always seems to say the wrong thing, right? Or maybe somebody that you can think of who seems to know how to comfort you. Right. And so this is exactly what we're talking about with social and emotional intelligences. So social intelligence is this idea that there's an intelligence involved in having successful social interactions, right? So some smarter people, or maybe not even, might have problems in more social areas of their life. And so maybe they don't know what the right thing is to say. They kind of end up offending people, right? So people can have varying degrees of social intelligence. And within social intelligence, one can have emotional intelligence. So this is part of social intelligence because it has to do with your ability to perceive other people's emotions, other people. So we've got the social component, to understand other people, manage them, and use them effectively in yourself and with others. Because we use emotions to maybe communicate things like how happy we are, how sad we are. And we also need to receive that information from other people and effectively understand these emotions to know what to do and how to do it appropriately, right? So people with higher emotional intelligence tend to have better job performance. They tend to be less impulsive. And tend to have more successful relationships, probably because they have these good people skills where they can manage their emotions and they're not causing any kind of disruption, but also at the same time, they're able to comfort people when needed and have awareness of situations, right, to achieve these kinds of goals. So yeah, this is this idea of social emotional intelligence, okay? So now that we've kind of defined and explored some ideas what people talk about in terms of intelligence, this more kind of academic sounding intelligence versus social and emotional, let's talk about tests for intelligence. Okay, so Alfred Binet developed the practical intelligence test. So back in the day, in about 1904, France passed a law where they required all children to attend school. Okay, so before that, maybe kids weren't all going to school, just the ones that could afford to or could take the time off to do that. And otherwise, they were helping their parents and maybe earning a living wage at this point, right? And so the government commissioned Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon to study and develop a test to identify children who would need extra help. Okay, so this is the big thing to keep in mind with Alfred Binet and his practical intelligence test. There were going to be some kids, right? When you start all of a sudden mandating all children go to school, where you're going to have kids across the spectrum of ages, from, 5 years up until 18. And or let's say 17, that's the cutoff. If they're all required to go to school, well, you can't just throw them in those grades and expect them to like all of a sudden pick up calculus if they've never learned basic math, right? So you want to you want to determine what their skill levels are. So Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon measured what they called mental age. And so mental age is basically this idea, or it's the, you can think about it as the the chronological age that corresponds to one's performance on a test. So in other words, your mental age is where you score on a test that indicates, when you, let's say, for example, you take a test and you're 15, but your test indicates that you read at a 12-year-old's level or a 10-year-old's level. Okay, this is your mental age. It's basically corresponding to your intelligence level of a certain chronicle age. Okay, so in other words, it's going to be, what you score in a test is basically going to tell you, okay, I am maybe 15, but I read at a 3rd grade level, right? This is what we call mental age versus chronological age. That's your actual age. So you can be 13 years old, right? That's your chronological age. And your performance on a test gives you your mental age. You're 13, but and that's your chronological, but your performance on that test might indicate that you really look more like you're, in 3rd grade, and that's because you maybe didn't have any kind of things like, somebody to teach you how to read and how to write. So the whole point behind this little background of what's going on is because Alfred Binet and Simon, Theodore Simon, developed this test to identify children that needed special attention. Okay, so the whole point of the practical intelligence test was just to figure out what people's mental age were at the time. So they could be 18 years old but reading at a 3rd grade level, right? Mental versus chronological versus mental age, right? And so this was only to identify, okay, well, if this person's 18 but they're reading at a 3rd grade level, chronological versus mental age, then we need to really give them some extra help to help them pass, or they might have to spend a few extra years in school to get them to the point where they need to be. When we think of what skill level people should be at when they're 18. Okay. So then the unfortunate thing behind the practical intelligence test was that people started to take this, out of context. And so Lewis Terman was one of those individuals who said, you know what, let's take these IQ tests and rename it, and let's use it as a test for inherited IQ, for inherited intelligence. Again, Binet did not want this at all. In fact, he explicitly said this isn't a test that's going to tell you how intelligent a person is. This is just a test to tell us where children might be so we can properly place them in classrooms that would be beneficial to them for learning. Okay. And so people took these tests and ran with them. So we've got Lewis Terman, who used Binet's test as a measure of inherited intelligence. So he revised the original test, called it the Stanford-Binet test. Okay, and so he revised that original test of mental age. When people would score, where it would tell you where their reading level was or their math level was, right? William Stern came along and decided, okay, well, we've got the test and it can give you some indication, but let's create a score. And that can tell us, that can give us better information as to where people are. But again, these individuals were both using this as a measure of inherited intelligence, how smart people are, when in fact this shouldn't be the case. So the original intelligence quotient formula was your mental age divided by your chronological age times 100. Okay, so for instance, if you're 16 years old, that's your chronological age, okay, 16, and here, let's write with that, right? Let's say you're 16. That might not work there, but we'll say that's your chronological age. And let's say your test tells you that you're at a 16-year-old level, okay, your mental age, right? That fraction is going to give you 1. If you multiply that times 100, that gives you 100, right? So that was the idea behind this. It could give you a number, kind of like a percentage almost, that tells you where you're lying in terms of inherited intelligence, right? So keep that in mind, right, as we move along. So for instance, to kind of give you some more examples, if a 16-year-old, right, think about that, chronological, we'll put a little C to indicate that, scores at the level of a 20-year-old, right? So that's our mental age, right? Because there may be scoring at the level, mathematically, verbally speaking, of a 20-year-old. What's their IQ? Take a moment to do the math. Okay, are you ready for the answer? 125, right? Because you're dividing 16 into 20, multiplying that by 100, you get 125. Now, what about if a 50-year-old performs as well as a typical 20-year-old, right? So we've got chronological again, and we've got mental age again. Take some time to calculate this. Okay, so answer 40, right? And by those standards back in the day, 40 would mean that you're scoring well below deficits. You're well below average. So average should be something like 100, right? You should be at the level of your age. But this really this really brought up this problem of it can work well for children, this intelligence quotient, but not adults, because you're, what does the performance of a 50-year-old look like? Intelligence doesn't necessarily work that way. If anything, it starts to kind of decline in older age, right? So now we don't use the intelligence quotient old formula anymore. That's done. Instead, we score IQ we do have a test for that, and we've developed a better test to try and get at people's actual inherited intelligence, kind of throwing away some of this crap that Terman and Stern did. And we now compare the performance to the average in your age group. Okay, so everybody's kind of taken this test, and people take it at all sorts of age groups. So if you're in their 50s, for instance, your score will be compared to people also, at your age level, right? And that gives you a better indication of your performance, because then, we're not doing this weird mental versus chronological age. But make sure you know the difference between the two come test time. Chronological, that's your actual age. Mental, that's the level we think you're thinking at compared to where we think you should be at chronologically, right? So if we think you should, your reading level is at a 6th grade level, but you're actually in 9th grade, well, those two, that's your mental age, right? That 6th grade level versus your chronological. Okay. So now we have revised tests. So we'll get into that. Okay. So let's talk about these newer tests, what we actually use now instead. So there are a couple of different kinds of tests to really distinguish between. Achievement tests test what you've learned. So these are tests that you take in classes, right? So I provide these achievement tests basically to try and figure out, have you learned anything in class? So it might be essays, it might be fill in the blank, all those kinds of things. Then you have aptitude tests, which are predicting the ability, or tests that predict the ability for you to learn a new skill or for you to do well in a particular profession or area. And so an example of this is something called the Graduate Requisite Exam, the GRE. Okay, and this is a test that people have to take in order to get into graduate school. Okay, particularly psychology majors might have to take the GRE if you're thinking of going into grad school, right? So GRE is just one of many. Your college entrance exams, SATs, ACTs, the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test. These are all tests that are expected to predict, right? They're expected to predict your performance in some kind of area. So for instance, the GRE is supposed to predict whether or not you'll succeed in grad school. That is, you can complete your coursework and pass and get a degree. Okay, so that's why they give those kinds of tests. That's why it's an aptitude versus achievement. It's not necessarily trying to measure what you've just learned. I mean, it kind of does, but it's more about predicting your ability to learn that new skill, right? Or to pass graduate school, for instance. So now we come to the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, known as the WAIS. Okay, and this is an intelligence scale, right? Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, it's in the name. This is the standard that people use to now measure what we think is inherited intelligence, okay? Most common used, and it's measuring overall intelligence. Again, what we think probably is G, okay? It measures things like verbal comprehension, perceptual organization, so spatial stuff, working memory, remember being able to juggle stuff in your mind, getting it into long-term memory, and processing speed. Okay, so these are various things that it tests for. It has 15 subtests within it, so somebody has to be trained in order to administer this test for you. It's not something you can kind of just take online. Okay, there's also a version for children. It's called the WISC. And so let's look at some of these items. Oops, sorry about that. So in the adult scale, it should look at things like similarities. So it might say, you know, they might ask you, how are cotton and wool alike? And you might say, well, they're natural fibers, right? Vocabulary items. What does considerate mean? They might ask you to do digit span tasks, which help test working memory. Okay, so they'll ask you to repeat these numbers, and they'll read off numbers to you: 5, 4, 9, 3, 8, 5. And so then you have to repeat it: 5, 4, 9, 3, 8, 5. And then they'll say 4, 7, 1, 8, 4, 9, 6, 2. Then you have to repeat that, and on and on. And what they're doing is they're tacking on more and more and more numbers to assess how well your working memory is, right? Because you have to rehearse these numbers in your brain: 5, 4, 9, 3, 8, 5, right? You're repeating them to yourself. And so your capacity for working memory can be determined by your ability to recall these long strings of numbers. It gets real annoying if you've ever done a digit span task. The most annoying ones are repeating them backwards: 2, 8, 4, 9, 5, 3, then 3, 5, 9, 4, 8, 2. And again, they're reading these out loud to you, right? So again, working memory can be quite taxing. And they'll also do block design with you. So they'll tell you, here's a picture, and here's some colored blocks, and make that look like that, right? And so that's basically your ability to reason in terms of perceptual organization, spatial kinds of skills. Okay, so they measure all sorts of different things in that adult test. Here's a WISC item for the kids. They'll do things like picture completion, because we're obviously not going to ask them, what does considerate mean? So kids will say, you know, get something that says, what's missing in this picture? So can you all tell what's missing in this little kitty cat picture? If you said the whiskers, you are correct. Here's another WISC item. They'll say things like, which one of these goes here to balance the scale? And they'll say, you know, here's some examples. If you have a purple rectangle, a blue square, and a star, that balances the scales because, you know, the purple rectangles equal each other, so you cancel that out. And so apparently the blue square and the star equal a red ball, right? And so on and so forth in all the examples. So can you all tell which one is the right answer? Pause the video if you want to take a moment and actually figure this out. Okay, I'm back with the answer. The answer is number 2. And I swear this becomes an argument in the class all the time. So I've broken it down for you here to explain why it's number 2, right? Why it's this blue star, this hexagon, and this star, right? To help balance the scale here, right? So take a moment to look at that if you really are invested in the answer. So we're moving forward. Okay, so, and just to give you really quickly, I guess before I move on to other things, in the WACE, the median is 100. So half of the people above and below this score score at 100, right? That's our median. That's where half people score above and below. The average is about 90 to 109. High average is 110 to 119. Superior is 120 to 129. Mensa status, meaning you can belong to this organization that says you're super smart, genius level, 130 plus, okay? Low averages are between 80 and 89. Borderline intellectual functioning, where you might have some intellectual disabilities, is in the range of 71 to 80. Moderate disabilities, or yeah, we can call it that, is 50 to 70, and scoring below 50 means that you might be severely intellectually impaired. Okay, so these have been standardized, and we'll chat about that on the next slide. But these are the standards that people, your age group you might be compared to, right? So scoring around average 90 to 109 on an intelligence test, that's where most people are going to lie. That's where you're going to see a lot of people. Okay, so let's really quickly review correlations. Remember back module 2, I believe, we talked about this, usually denoted by the lowercase r, known as a Pearson's correlation. Correlations can range from 1 to 1, -1 to +1, I should say, not to confuse everybody. And there are a couple of other things. Values closer to 1, the absolute value of 1, so negative or +1, tell you that there's a stronger relationship, okay? Values close to 0 means there's no relationship between two variables. So think about ice cream sales and murder rates, right? Maybe there's a really strong relationship close to 1, maybe it's like 0.60, and that's our R. Oops, sorry, I was trying to make a dot there, right? And so maybe as ice cream sales go up, murder sales go up because it's a positive number, right? So plus or minus tells you the direction of the relationship, right? So here's a graph of maybe we're clocking in ice cream sales, and this is them increasing, and murder rates increasing, okay? So keep that in mind. We usually use scatter plots. If there's no relationship, you'll see randomness here, right? And in a I'm sorry, I was going backwards. Yeah, positive. Where's my negative? So these are just some examples of how we graph these things, right? So height, for instance, as people's height increases, usually their weight also increases because there's more of you. So you're gonna get a pretty good trend of that. You can, if you know somebody's height, 120 centimeters, you might also know their weight in kilograms, obviously. Okay. So they only indicate an association, not a causal relationship. Your height doesn't cause your weight, right? So this will come in handy, I promise you, as we move forward. So the way we adopt these tests is we standardize these tests. So what we'll do is, like with the WACE, okay, the Wechsler Intelligence Scores, we'll take a giant group of people, huge sample, thousands and thousands of people, if not millions, right? And we'll have them all take the test, and they're going to range in terms of age and sex and all that fun stuff. And that's what we want. We want a good representation of our population in the United States. And so you take a lot of people, get them to take these tests, and then you see how they score, and you plot it out in terms of frequencies. So for instance, you might, plot out how many people score at 100, right? And so this indicates that there are a ton of people score at 100, right? And so you get less people scoring lower and you get less people scoring higher. That's what this curve indicates, okay? Before I talk about that, let me talk about a couple of other issues. So that's what we mean by standardization. So Now we have a set, you know, range of scores. So if you score 100 and most people score within 100, then we believe that you're scoring on average, right? Because your average would lie within one standard deviation of your mean, which is right smack in the middle, which is 100. Okay, so people who maybe score further out, there's less of them, right? But then we can identify if they're, you know, if what we consider kind of low functioning versus really high functioning in terms of intelligence. Okay, so this is what we do. You take a really large sample of the test and then you update it every, you know, so often, every 10 years, whatever, and you can re-standardize it because times might change. Before, people maybe had to learn how to scour pots, and now we care more about this kind of spatial abilities and we know more about working memory, so we kind of have to change things, right? And so there's this interesting effect in intelligence known as the Flynn effect. So over time, if you compare people from like the 1920s to now on an intelligence scale, intelligence seems intelligence seems to have increased over time. And so I want you to think and try and pause the video here and think what some reasons for this effect are before I give you the answer. And so reasons behind this effect range from things like, well, there's better nutrition now. People have more food that's readily available and more access to better food. And of course, this isn't always the same across people of different socioeconomic statuses, but still, this is something nonetheless that is occurring. There's better education now. You know, we mandated, education for all. People might be in more stimulating environments. There's less childhood disease. Thank you, vaccines and, antibiotics and stuff, right? And so all of these different things can affect one's intelligence. And also, people are having, less children. They have smaller families, so they're better able to invest in their kids, okay? So another way we adopt these tests is we also test their reliability, okay? So reliability is basically the consistency of your test scores, okay? And you can break this up in a couple of different ways. There's split half reliability, and all that means is you take one whole test, you can cut it in half, right? So let's say you have a test and it's 100 items. You take items 1 through 50, and then you take items 51 through 100, and you get a correlation between the two. Remember, we talked about that. So what that should tell you is if you score high on one half of the test, you should score high on the other half of the test if there's good reliability. If your test is consistently measuring what it should measure, then you have that split half reliability, right? So you can randomly choose 50 of those questions from the test, and then the other 50, score them and see if people have high correlations between the two. Then there's test-retest reliability. And this is basically you taking one test, waiting a week or a year or whatever it is, and taking that test again. So if we give you the IQ test, you get a score of 100. And then, a year down the road, you take it again and you get a score of 102. That's pretty similar. Again, you look at the correlation between the two, and that gives you test-retest reliability. That tells you you've got probably a pretty reliable test. You've got consistency. And validity is another thing we have to assess when we adopt these tests. Validity is a little bit different than reliability, but it's connected. So validity is about, are we measuring the thing we say that we're measuring? Okay, so for instance, you don't step on a scale to tell you what your height is, right? Unless you've got those fancy doctor scales that have the height bar, but the scale itself, these numbers here, don't tell you your height, right? That's validity. Validity, if you have a highly valid scale, weight, for instance, it's going to tell you how much you weigh, right? So there are a couple of different ways you can also measure validity. And for something to be valid, it also not only has to measure what you're intending it to measure, but it also has to be reliable. Ooh, if I can do this. Reliable. It's real hard, y'all. to write with a clicker. Oh, that's going to get in the way. Let me get rid of that. Okay, so again, something that's valid means that it's measuring what you intend it to measure, and it's also reliable. So for instance, something like a scale, just to give you one last example, it can say, let's say you pop onto it and it says you're 150 pounds. Okay, well, that's all fine and good. You can keep popping on to the scale on and off and on and off, and it can always tell you 150 pounds. But let's say your actual weight is 160 pounds. That means that your scale's off by 10 pounds. It's not valid because it's not measuring what you intend to measure. It's not accurate. Instead, it's off by 10 pounds and you have to recalibrate it. It's reliable because it's always giving you the same measurement, right? If it wasn't reliable, you could pop onto it, it would say 150, and then pop off and pop on the next second, and it would say 160. That means it's not reliable and it's not valid. So in order for something to be valid, it has to be reliable. It gives you a consistent reading, right? It gives you a consistent score, and it has to measure what you intend it to measure. So it needs to be accurate in giving you the right weight, okay? So we've got content validity, which basically is this idea of, does your test measure all of the things that you think should be included in the construct? So going back to this idea of measuring intelligence, right? If you think intelligence is about verbal abilities and working memory, then content validity would mean you're asking questions about verbal ability and working memory, right? If that's what we define intelligence as. If we think intelligence is just working memory, then all you need to do is measure working memory, right? So that's content validity. Predictive validity is, does your test predict important outcomes like the GRE? We expect that to predict your ability to do well in graduate school. Will you succeed in graduate school, right? If it doesn't predict that, well, then it doesn't have predictive validity because it's probably not measuring what we think it's supposed to measure. If we think GRE scores should predict something, then it's not valid if it's not predicting that outcome. Okay. And so to end this last bit of intelligence, before we move on to some genetic environmental influences, let's talk about some of the stability across the lifespan. So you can look at cross-sectional research where you're measuring two groups at the same time point. So in other words, let's say we measure people's IQ in terms of the WAIS in 1990, right? And this is what we got. We got people who score on the IQ based on whether or not they're young, whatever we're going to define as young, and old. Okay, so cross-sectional research is measuring two different age groups, let's say, or just groups in general at the same time point, right? Lower scores tend to be more frequent among older adults relative to younger adults. That's generally because over time, as you get older and older, you start to see decrements in your performance, spatial abilities, thought speed, and things like that. Longitudinal research, in contrast, might look at something like age across time. Okay, so it's going to follow the same people over time. We'll call them a cohort. So we'll get a group, let's say maybe it's a group of you all, and I want to track you over time in my intro class, and I get you all in your 20s, let's say. Okay, because most people will be. Excuse me for any older adults who might be listening to this. So I capture you when you're at 20, and then maybe at 35, and then at 50, and at 65, and 80, and 95, right? And I look at you over time, and I can look at your IQ over time and kind of determine how stable intelligence might be over time. And it is. Intelligence remains relatively stable until about late adulthood, where you start to see some sharper decrements, okay? And again, that's just going to kind of be this natural decline in our cognitive abilities. This is different than things like dementia. Those aren't typical, that's not typical aging, okay? That's a disorder. We might, that's something that you could look into. So why, I guess I'll pose this question to you all and you can think about this. Why do cross-sectional and longitudinal data yield different results for intelligence, right? In other words, what I mean is, why would cross-sectional data lead us to believe that older adults are less intelligent when it seems that intelligence is pretty stable throughout our lifetimes, right? Well, when you measure people at the same time point, let's say that we measured people in 1990 here, okay? And so this is all indicative of 1990. Sorry for the terrible handwriting. What this is telling us is, again, these are different cohorts, right, from different different eras. And so older people might have grown up in a time where there was less push for education. They were working more so, and it wasn't mandated for them to, oh, sorry about that. Sorry about that, y'all. So let's get back on point. So this might occur because, again, we've got different cohorts, right? And that goes back to the Flynn effect. Older people might have, back in the day, had less education. And so you're going to have these kinds of differences in intelligence and other things. Maybe there's better nutrition now. And again, you're going to get a mix of people who also are maybe older in age, and that's going to really drop the IQ level down, okay? Or at least the WAIS score down. Okay, so let's move forward and talk about this last bit of intelligence. Let's talk about genetic and environmental influences. This is always a real fun topic. There's a lot of different fun things going on here. Okay, so let's look at some of the research on intelligence and how we're able to figure out whether or not intelligence is influenced by genetics versus the environment. And so overall, intelligence seems to be really highly influenced by genetics. Okay, so you can thank your parents for your brains. The heritability, remember that, told you these things tie into one another. The heritability of intelligence is between 50 and 80%. So remember, that's the idea that 50% or 80%, between 50 and 80% of the differences between people in intelligence can be explained by genes. Okay, and so we know this because we've looked at things like monozygotic twins, and by we I mean other researchers who do research on intelligence. I do not. Monozygotic twins, remember, those are the identical twins. They came from the same egg and they split up. And it got divided, so it was the same fertilized egg. They're genetically identical. When they're raised together, they're similar to retests of the same individual. Okay, so think about that. Remember, test-retest reliability is when one person, let's say me, I'm not a twin, I take a test, and then maybe a year later, I take a test again, and my scores are pretty similar. That's what happens with monozygotic twins. If you give each twin the test and then correlate them, those twins raised together seem to have similar scores to that of test-retests of the same individual. That's how similar their intelligences are, meaning you've got two people who are clones of each other, and if they each take an independent test, they're highly correlated with one another, meaning it's probably their genes that's explaining this kind of effect. And so the R, to just throw in some more terms here, the R for these identical twins, okay, is usually the correlation between their two tests, or their intelligence, is 0.86, okay. Fraternal twins is 0.60. Biological parents, their correlation between biological parents and their own scores or our own scores in intelligence is 0.42. And people who are adopted have a correlation of 0.19. In other words, your adopted parents and your correlation between them and your intelligence is 0.19, right? So numbers closer to 1, right, like this one is, means it's stronger, meaning it's probably something going on with genetics that's really driving our intelligence performance. So genetics tends to be more apparent with age. So when you look at kids who are adopted into a family, and you look at the correlation of their intelligence between them and their adoptive parents, you get this modest correlation, right? And so like I said before, you might get a correlation of 0.19. That's not nothing, but that's not as big as 0.86, right? The correlation gets smaller and smaller and smaller. It might approach 0.02 at some point, okay, by the time the kids grow up to be adults, meaning if they're being adopted into this family, and if the environment, i.e. their adoptive parents, had an influence on their IQ, you would either see this stay stable or go up. But instead, the correlation goes down, okay? It starts to decrease as these people share this household with their adoptive parents, right? And so this is a good indication that over time, we really start to see that kids, as they move into adulthood, become less and less similar in terms of intelligence to their adoptive parents, or it's at least not correlated, okay? And so intelligence, another kind of fun fact of them, is that it's polygenetic. In other words, there's not one gene that explains all of intelligence. It's determined by multiple genes. So you can't just isolate the smart gene and say, oh, I'm going to tweak it and CRISPR it and make me a smart baby. Okay, not that simple. Obviously, our noodles are more complex than that. So let's talk about some biological correlates now that we've learned about some of the research on twins, right? So the physical aspects of the brain, right? Its brain volume is also associated with intelligence. So if you get the correlation between somebody's IQ score, their intelligence, and brain volume, right, white and gray matter, that's a correlation of 0.33. That's a medium effect. That's moderate. That's not nothing. Okay, but that doesn't mean that's everything, right? It's still kind of far away from 1. So brain volume isn't always explaining or isn't the best explanation for intelligence, right? So usually people who have high intelligence scores tend to also have a greater number and depth of the sulci in the brain. And so we think this is because then there's a higher number of neurons, right? So we think this is what's kind of going on, right? Because if there's more folds in the brain, that means that there's more of it, and that kind of also is correlated with this brain volume, right? And you do see enlargement in specific brain areas, particularly our frontal and parietal lobes, okay? So that's where you really see some different structural kinds of changes, okay? And also, some other interesting fun facts about intelligence is people who are more intelligent usually show less brain activity when they're thinking about things. So usually this is kind of thought of as a weird effect. And you heard me, right? More intelligent, you see less brain activity on certain tasks. And it's thought that people are using their brain more efficiently. And so that's why there's not as much activity. It's because they're not trying to tax their brain. They've found a way to use it more efficiently. Okay, and they usually have higher brain speed. In other words, they can maybe press a lighted button quicker, and that might be related to working memory. Okay, so there are some environmental influences. Okay, so again, intelligence is mostly determined by our genes, but the environment can play a role. Okay, so if you look at twin studies, monozygotic twins that are raised apart tend to be less similar than monozygotic twins raised together. Okay, again, these are identical twins, right? Monozygotic versus dizygotic. So identical twins who are raised apart, they're put in different environments, okay? They tend to then have a smaller correlation between IQs, or less than monozygotic twins that get to be raised in the same environment, which then tells you, okay, we changed the environment, right? These monozygotic twins have the same genes, but we've changed the environment for these guys versus these other ones. So the ones raised apart are going to be a little bit less similar, okay? But again, this is why you see over time with age, you start to see more genetic, the effects of genes on intelligence kind of comes out, but the influence of your early environment is important. Intelligence does tend to get more stable as we get older. So that's one kind of indication that early on, your intelligence can fluctuate when you're younger, but when you're older, it kind of stays the same until you start to see declines. In impoverished communities, for instance, there's an example of Iranian orphanages that showed that these kids who were raised in these kinds of impoverished environments where they had minimal interactions with caregivers, maybe they weren't being held enough because there weren't enough caregivers to go around to stimulate the child to play with them, to interact with them. These kids show a decline in IQ. Okay. And so they'll also suffer other kinds of delayed developments, like not being able to sit up by age 2 or walking by age 4. And they should be doing those things a little bit earlier than that. But if you catch it early enough and you give more attention to these kids and you train them, this can help with their intelligence scores. So moral of the story is early environment, especially bad environments, when you're in some kind of impoverished community, maybe a low income household where you might not have as many resources, that tends to explain decreases in intelligence scores early on. Okay. And so other examples of this, like in the impoverished communities, kids might suffer from malnutrition, sensory deprivation, social isolation, the kinds of stuff that Jeannie, the feral child, was going through, right? She was neglected highly, not given very good things to eat, not given any kind of sensory stimuli because she was kept in a dark room and nobody talked to her. And so she was also socially isolated, right? These things early on can affect your IQ. So it's good to provide good environments early for kids. But again, environment is restricted in its impact on IQ or in intelligence. These people who put out these kinds of baby Mozart things, where they say, have your kid listen to Mozart and these baby Einstein tapes, and you're going to see them become geniuses. Going the other way with it, where you give your kids all these opportunities, well, that's going to hit a ceiling at some point. It'll only do so much. It's not going to make them geniuses, because by that time, their intelligence is already kind of determined. So as long as you don't deprive kids early on, they're going to get as intelligent as they're going to get, right? Okay, so let's broach this topic on sex differences. Okay, so people always kind of are weary about talking about sex differences because the unfortunate thing is people misinterpret and oversimplify the research on differences based off sex. Okay, so we'll get into that, but you see similarities. Males and females tend to be pretty highly similar with respect to G. If you measure G, general intelligence, your WAIS scores, males and females are going to be similar. There are sex differences, though, in certain other kinds of skills. Women tend to show a little bit better verbal abilities. They're better at interpersonal acuity. So verbal abilities, basically, that's like women are better in writing, language use, reading. They have better episodic memory, so personal events, right? We talked about episodic versus semantic. Okay. Interpersonal acuity, again, that's kind of dealing with this more emotional intelligence component. And object location, I know that kind of sounds weird, but we talked about this a little bit in one of our other classes. In terms of object location, it was thought that women gathered food in our hunter-gatherer days, and so they had to use landmarks to navigate their world. Whereas if men went longer distances to go hunt for food, it was better that they knew north, south, east, west direction, right? The direction of the area. So navigate with the sky and things like that. So women tend to be better with object location in terms of like using landmarks, let's say. And the sensory sensitivity, we talked about this, women tend to have more sensitive abilities in smells, in sight, and in hearing, okay, compared to men. So there's some interesting differences. Men tend to have a higher ability compared to women in spatial ability. So sometimes they'll be asked, okay, here's a block. If you rotate it in space, which of these blocks is the same, right? So you'll compare the two. This is confusing me just to begin with. But if you mentally rotate these, are these two the same or are these two the same, right? And so those are, again, spatial abilities that men tend to be a little bit better in, and they do show slight advantages in like complex math, okay, like calculus, geometry. But again, the differences tend to be small. Remember we talked about R. They don't explain all of people's abilities in math. So just because I know your sex doesn't mean I know that you're going to be good at object location, for instance, or you're going to be good at complex math. That's an oversimplification, but we do see at least sex differences. And this is where people get things wrong, right? Another interesting thing about guys is they tend to demonstrate a lot more variability in their mental ability. And what I mean by that is you saw that normal curve before where people tend to score mostly in the 100 range on this intelligence scale, right? But with men, you tend to see, let me just change this real quick. With men, you tend to see these kinds of squatter types of ranges, okay? So they have a higher proportion of people who score on the long range of intelligence tests. So you get more geniuses, let's say, but then you also get a lot more not so smart guys, okay? So their scores tend to spread out more compared to women who might look more like normal curves, okay? So this is kind of a really interesting thing. My husband always tells me all the time that, yeah, guys might have a lot of geniuses, but also have a lot of not very intelligent men. That might kind of be a fun thing, right? So some people, again, suggest that there's an adaptive evolutionary functioning to these differences, like what was more important to women versus men back in our evolutionary past. And so this is why we see these trade-offs. I wouldn't say, you know, you should avoid thinking about it as people are better or worse, right? It's more about trade-offs. So, you know, women are better at object location, whereas dudes are better at spatial abilities on average, typically. But again, they're trade-offs, not good or bad, they just are. And that's where people start to cross a line. Other things to offer up is sometimes you see these differences disappear in these more gender equal societies. So when you see societies that don't have such strict gender roles, like men should, you know, go out and hunt, women are going to stay home and take care of the kids, then you start to see some of these differences disappear. And again, that makes sense. In their evolutionary past, maybe they didn't have these kinds of divisions, and so then you see less of these differences. And differences aren't bad. That's the problem I think that people have in their mind. It's more about they have, you know, they have trade-offs. Some people are better in this than others, but that doesn't mean that you can't build that skill. And it also doesn't mean that you should, you know, hire people based off of their sex because you think they're going to be better at locating objects and stuff. Okay. So those are some fun facts in sex differences. Now let's talk about group differences in terms of race and ethnicity. Okay. And again, people run away with this kind of shit and it's annoying because they don't understand the science behind it. So generally speaking, when you do measure people in intelligences, Asian individuals tend to score higher compared to Europeans. European white individuals tend to score higher than Hispanic, who then score higher than African Americans, okay? And so these are, again, very small differences. You do see these differences, but again, that R is going to be real teeny tiny, right? And so knowing somebody's race isn't indicative of their intelligence. And this is, again, where people run away with this kind of research, and then people shy away from doing this research because then they're admonished for being racist or something. These are the facts, but you don't use, you know, genetics are still going to be much more better at predicting somebody's intelligence than something like sex or age, right? The gap between these people seem to be, or these different races, I should say, seem to be narrowing for anybody after 1970s. So again, if you think about what was going on at this point, in the 60s, there were the civil rights movements, you know, mid 50s to 60s. And so now you might start to see shifts, whereas Latino individuals, African Americans might have been treated differently than their white counterparts or their Asian counterparts. Now they have better advantages, so they can go to schools that have more, you know, better equipped facilities and things like that. Again, early environmental influences can then impact those IQs, right? So now these kids growing up in these better environments start to show smaller and smaller differences in terms of intelligence tests, right? So I've kind of already said some things, right? Whites may have had more access to resources than others, like schools and educational opportunities, prior to the 70s or even before that, right? And again, relatively free from discrimination. I'm not saying whites aren't discriminated against now, especially poor individuals tend to be discriminated against, but relatively free from the discrimination that people were experiencing or putting forth towards African Americans, Hispanics, and even Asians. They built the railroads a lot and emigrated from here. And other groups also experience these types of discriminatory actions, right? Separate but equal was part of the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling back before our civil rights. And then Brown v. Board of Education said, we should integrate schools. And so a lot of that is explaining some of these differences, and now the gaps tend to be narrowing, okay? And so there can be some other issues that affect our scores on these tests. For instance, test takers have certain expectations. One of these things that can kind of then affect their test scores based off of expectations is this idea known as stereotype threat. This is the idea that you are afraid that you're going to confirm a stereotype against your group, so much so that you end up confirming that stereotype and doing the thing that is expected of you, okay, in a negative way. So for instance, if females have this idea, and again, this is why it's so important to understand the research behind all this. If females believe that they're not as good at math as men are, right? And you put them in a room full of a bunch of dudes, and they're the only female taking a math test, they might get anxious because they're activating the stereotype of, oh my God, women just do not do well in math, right? Stereotype, untrue. So they're so afraid that they're going to confirm this stereotype that they actually get so anxious it decreases their performance, thus confirming the stereotype. So it's a bit of this self-fulfilling prophecy that's going on. Okay, so again, this might be what's happening with some of these groups that have been labeled in the past as being not as intelligent or not as good in some of these areas. And that's where we can run into some trouble, right? So it's really important that you all understand that these group-based differences really provide limited information on an individual's performance. Again, if I were to point to everybody in the class and just look at their sex and say, oh, you're probably going to do poor in this class or good in this class, that's not going to tell me much. Group-based differences just give us a general average. It's hard for us to then predict what an individual would do, right? Because again, you've got that normal curve where most people score here, but you've still got people scoring on either end, right? So me trying to guess, like on average, you'll probably score here. It's hard for me, you know, an individual could be scoring here or here on an intelligence test. It's hard for me to know based off of just sex, okay? And finally, to wrap up, we've got a couple other slides. I'm going to talk about ethics, but to wrap up this whole debate, right? Again, these group differences aren't across sex, I should say, and gender, but biological sex and race are not indicative of these biological or genetic-driven etiology. In other words, they're, you know, where they come from. In other words, just like I've been kind of adamant about saying before, just because I know your sex and race, it doesn't mean that it's biologically determined, right? So for instance, the average IQ today exceeds the average IQ of the 1930s population, more so than our current differences between blacks and whites on intelligence. So think about that. People in the 1930s, their average IQ is lower than our average IQ today. And that difference, okay, between today's IQ and the 1930s is a much greater difference than the differences we see between black and white individuals, okay, or Hispanic and white individuals. And so again, that means that then there's only a small difference between black and white individuals, Hispanic and white individuals in terms of IQ on average, okay, it's a really tiny difference versus if we compare people back in the day to our current IQ, right? And again, this could be an environmental thing, right? Black and Hispanic individuals were not afforded the same types of benefits as whites back in the day. And now that gap is closing, right? There are some changes happening, and that seems to be changing much more so now. Countries with larger SES discrepancies tend to have a large rich to poor IQ gap. So in other words, countries where you only have like a high class and low class and nobody in between in terms of socioeconomic status, cha-ching, how much money they're making, right? Then they also tend to see a bigger IQ gap between who are poor and who are rich, meaning there might be something going on environmentally early on that's affecting their IQs, okay? And also there can be some cultural differences. Asian Americans tend to excel in IQ scores, but it's usually because their culture tends to put a lot of pressure on academic excellence, right? So that's another thing that can affect IQ. If you grow up in this environment where academic performance is highly prized and that's what you excel towards, then you're going to start to see differences, right? And finally, we talked about stereotype. So just to kind of wrap these up in a nice, neat bow, some people might feel this kind of stereotype threat and are afraid of confirming this stereotype that they're stupid, right? And then they do poorly on a test, and that kind of confirms things. So we have to overcome those kinds of problems. So I know I'm beating a dead horse with this. Last couple of slides, y'all. Just to really hammer home this idea, because I don't want people going away to say like, oh, Dr. V said that like women are stupider than men. That's not the point of this lecture at all. Instead, it's just we see some differences, but at the same time, there are reasons behind these differences, and the effects can be small, right? Not every effect is created equally. So there's this thing called the naturalistic fallacy, which means that some people think what is means it's what ought to be. An example of this is people who think there are serial killers think there should be serial killers. This is a naturalistic fallacy because just because something is doesn't mean it should be, right? So just because there are differences between groups doesn't mean there should be differences. Oh, there are differences in terms of spatial ability between men and women. There should be differences. This is not the case, right? Notice the strikeout here. Across cultures, men engage in more short-term mating. We talked about this with the evolutionary psychology. That doesn't mean that men should engage in short-term mating and going around and spreading their seed everywhere, right? So same thing. Men have better abilities in complex math. Doesn't mean that men should be involved in more positions that require complex math. That doesn't mean that you should discriminate in your hiring just because there's a dude there. Or same thing with females. Okay. So this is the naturalistic fallacy, when people believe what is should be what ought to be. But this isn't the case, right? We find these differences, but so what? That doesn't mean that that's the way the world should be. We just can detect these differences, okay? And finally, I will conclude this 2-hour-long lecture by giving you some fun thoughts from a nihilist, okay? Humans value intelligence, right? We are the ones who put value to things. Same thing with money. The paper and metal in your pocket only has value because we've assigned value to it. So humans value intelligence. But there are so many other species on this planet that continue to exist without what we call intelligence, right? We have frontal lobes and we can reason and problem solve and all this fun stuff. But other species exist, and they're going to long exist without us. You know, when we eventually screw this world over and are gone, without intelligence, right? There are these cool things called tardigrades, which are micro animals that can survive super extreme temperatures, super extreme pressure, live without air for some given time. They can be exposed to radiation and live. They can be dehydrated, starve, and are at least 530 million years old. Okay, and they've taken these things up into space, and these guys survive, right? So tardigrades, also known as water bearers, are highly skilled survivalists, but you know, they don't have the intelligence that we so much prize. Same thing with bacteria. Bacteria grows and it persists and it lives. So you know, I'm beating a dead horse here, but I really want to kind of put this forth. Again, we prize intelligence, but for what? For what kinds of reasons? These creatures seem to do well enough without any kind of intelligence, right? That we define as intelligence. Again, humans are valuing that. And again, this is why, and I have to give credit to my husband here, another psychologist, who talks about trade-offs, okay? Really, things that you think are deficits, you can think of as just trade-offs, okay? So some things that we consider deficits in, you know, one area can be beneficial depending on the context. So for instance, sometimes if you feel like you're super impulsive, right? I have no self-control when it comes to like pie and cake and candies and all sorts of stuff. So Halloween is a real hard time for me because we buy candy for kids and I'm just eating it up, right? So I'm highly impulsive in that sense, and it makes it really hard because I could have a propensity to develop diabetes, so I got to be careful, right? But in a very harsh environment where maybe food is really scarce, it's good for me to be impulsive and just eat whatever the hell's around, right? Because in a really harsh environment, if I'm stuck in the middle of the desert, and all of a sudden I see a donut laying on a rock, it's probably smart to eat that donut and be impulsive and not think twice about it, to be like, I'm really watching my figure when I'm not going to eat for a week. And so it can be impulsivity, even though we think it's a bad thing, can be good in certain contexts. So, you know, chew on that for a moment. Think about how we put these labels on things. But again, these are trade-offs. So yeah, impulsivity might not be good, maybe in certain situations, but could be good in others, okay? And with that, I leave you all. Thank you for joining me down this very long trip of intelligence and talking about language. Feel free to email me with questions as you review this video. And I will see you all Monday if you haven't, you know, if you basically have watched this video before Monday. And if not, then, you know, I'm talking to you from the past, I suppose.